The gunshot that killed Grace Jennings' husband in 1877 didn't just take Thomas from her. It stole every dream she'd carefully tucked away in the corners of her heart. 3 years later, in the spring of 1880, Grace stood in the doorway of her small ranch house outside San Jose, California, watching dust devils dance across the dry earth. Convinced at 34 that her time for romance had passed like morning dew under the merciless sun. Her hands were rough now, calloused from work that no woman should have to do alone. The ranch Thomas had built, just 20 acres with a modest herd, had become her prison and her purpose. Every fence she mended, every cow she tended, every dawn she greeted alone reminded her that she was a survivor, not a woman worth courting. The mirror showed her the truth each morning, lines around her eyes that hadn't been there when Thomas was alive, gray threading through the brown hair she kept tied back in a severe bun, skin weathered from too many days in the California sun. Grace poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove, black and bitter as her prospects. The cup warmed her hands as she surveyed the property through the window. The fence along the eastern pasture sagged dangerously, and she'd been putting off fixing it for weeks. Pride kept her from asking for help, and practicality kept her from hiring anyone. Every dollar had to stretch, had to count, had to last. The sound of hoofbeats made her set down the cup. Visitors were rare, and her hand instinctively moved toward the rifle she kept by the door. A lone rider approached, silhouetted against the morning sun. As he drew closer, Grace could make out a tall man on a paint horse, sitting easy in the saddle like he'd been born there. He stopped at a respectful distance from the house and removed his hat. "Morning, madam. Name's Asher Kane. I'm looking for work, and I heard in town you might need a hand." Grace stepped onto the porch, keeping her expression neutral. Asher Kane looked to be in his early 30s, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of good whiskey. His clothes were worn but clean, and he had the lean, rangy build of a man who knew hard work. "I don't recall putting out word I was hiring," Grace said, crossing her arms. "You didn't, madam, but folks in San Jose talk, and they mentioned the Jennings ranch could use some help. I'm good with cattle, better with horses, and I can mend just about anything that's broken." His voice was deep and steady, with a hint of something that might have been Missouri or Kansas in his accent. "I can't pay much," Grace said, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of turning away help she desperately needed. "Didn't ask about pay yet, madam, just asking if you need the help." Grace studied him for a long moment. There was something different about Asher Kane, something in the way he looked at her, not with pity or calculation but with simple respect. "That fence there needs mending," she said finally, gesturing toward the eastern pasture. "And the barn roof's got holes. And the water pump's been temperamental." "I can handle all that," Asher said, "if you're willing to give me a chance." "There's a small bunkhouse behind the barn," Grace heard herself saying. "It's not much, but it's dry. I can offer $30 a month in meals." Asher's face broke into a smile that transformed his serious features. "That's generous, madam. I accept." As he rode toward the barn to settle his horse, Grace wondered what she'd just done. She'd been alone for 3 years, fiercely independent, and now she'd invited a stranger onto her property. But watching Asher Kane swing down from his saddle with the grace of a natural horseman, she felt something she'd thought long dead stir faintly in her chest. By midday, Asher had already started on the fence. Grace brought him water and found him working steadily in the heat, his shirt soaked with sweat. He'd removed his hat, and she could see the sun glinting off his dark hair. "You should rest during the hottest part of the day," she said, handing him the canteen. He drank deeply before answering. "Appreciate the concern, madam, but I'm used to working through." "Grace," she said suddenly. "You can call me Grace. All this madam makes me feel ancient." Asher's eyes met hers and she saw warmth there. "Grace then, and I'm Asher. How long have you been drifting, Asher?" "About 2 years. Had my own place up in Oregon, but after my wife died, I couldn't stay. Everything reminded me of her." His voice was matter of fact, but Grace heard the pain underneath. "I understand," she said quietly. "My husband's been gone 3 years, and sometimes I still expect to see him come riding up that road." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, two people marked by loss, before Grace turned back toward the house. "I'll have dinner ready at 6, she called over her shoulder. The days fell into a rhythm. Asher worked from dawn to dusk, tackling every task Grace had been putting off and finding others that needed attention. He was thorough and skilled, and the ranch began to show the care it had been missing. But what surprised Grace most was how Asher treated her. He would appear at her door each morning, hat in hand, and ask what she needed done. He listened to her opinions about the ranch work as though they mattered, as though she knew what she was talking about. When she mentioned wanting to expand the herd, he didn't dismiss the idea but helped her calculate costs and benefits. When the water pump finally gave out completely, he rode into San Jose and came back with parts, but he also brought her a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd spotted along the road. "Thought they might brighten your table," he said, handing them to her with a slight awkwardness that was somehow endearing. Grace took the flowers, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," Asher said simply. That evening, as Grace arranged the wildflowers in a mason jar, she caught sight of her reflection in the window. For just a moment, she didn't see the worn widow but the girl she'd been, the one who'd believed in romance and possibilities. The thought frightened her, and she pushed it away. But Asher continued his gentle courtship in ways Grace hadn't experienced even when she was young. When she mentioned offhandedly that she missed music, he produced a harmonica the next evening and played old songs on the porch while she finished mending. When she complained about her aching back after a long day, he offered to teach her some stretches he'd learned from a medicine woman in his travels, his hands respectful but warm as he guided her through the movements. "You know I'm not a young woman," Grace said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the California hills gold and crimson. "I'm 34, and I've got more miles on me than that old buckboard." Asher turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You know what I see when I look at you, Grace." She shook her head, not trusting her voice. "I see a woman who's stronger than she knows. I see someone who didn't give up when she had every reason to. I see beautiful brown eyes that light up when you talk about your plans for this ranch. I see hands that can gentle a spooked horse and make the best cornbread I've ever tasted." He paused, then added quietly, "I see the woman I'd like to court if you'd let me." Grace's throat tightened. "Asher, I'm not the courting type anymore. Those days are behind me." "Why? Because you've lived." "Because you've lost." "Grace, I lost my Sarah when I was 29. Does that mean I'm too worn out for a second chance at happiness?" He reached over and took her hand, his touch gentle. "Age isn't measured in years. It's measured in whether you still have room in your heart for something new." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. "I don't know if I remember how." "Then let me remind you," Asher said softly. The next Sunday, Asher asked Grace if she'd like to ride into San Jose with him. "There's a social at the church," he said. "Music, dancing, food. I thought you might enjoy getting off the ranch for an evening." Grace's first instinct was to refuse. She hadn't been to a social since Thomas died, hadn't felt like she belonged in those gatherings of couples and families. But something in Asher's hopeful expression made her reconsider. "I don't have anything suitable to wear," she said, already making excuses. "The blue dress you wore to town last week looked plenty suitable to me," Asher countered. "But this isn't about what you wear, Grace. It's about whether you want to go with me." She did want to go, Grace realized with surprise. She wanted to walk into that church on Asher Kane's arm, wanted to feel like someone worth courting, wanted to remember what it felt like to be young and hopeful. "All right," she said. "I'll go." Asher's face lit up like she'd given him a precious gift. "I'll polish my boots," he said seriously, making her laugh for the first time in longer than she could remember. The social was in full swing when they arrived. The small church in San Jose was crowded with ranchers and townspeople, all dressed in their Sunday best. Grace felt self-conscious as they entered, aware of the curious glances and whispered conversations. The widow Jennings, out with a man who wasn't her husband. She almost turned to leave, but Asher's hand found hers. "Head up," he murmured. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." Martha Peterson, who ran the general store, approached with a warm smile. "Grace, how wonderful to see you out. And you must be the young man who's been helping at the Jennings place." "Asher Kane, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "Pleased to meet you." "Well, any man who can get Grace to leave that ranch deserves a medal," Martha said with a wink. "Grace, dear, you look lovely. I haven't seen color in your cheeks in years." Before Grace could respond, the music started. A small group of musicians had gathered in the corner, fiddle, guitar, and someone on a makeshift drum. The lively tune filled the room, and couples began to form on the dance floor. Asher turned to Grace and extended his hand. "May I have this dance?" Grace hesitated. "I'm not sure I remember how." "I'll lead," Asher said. "Just follow me." His hand was warm and sure as he led her onto the floor. At first, Grace was stiff, overly conscious of the other dancers and the watching eyes. But Asher was patient, guiding her through the steps with quiet confidence. Gradually, she relaxed, let herself feel the music, feel the warmth of his hand at her waist. "You're doing fine," Asher said, smiling down at her. "I feel foolish," Grace admitted. "A woman my age dancing like a girl. Why shouldn't you dance, Grace? You act like being 34 means you're ready for the grave." "My mother was still dancing at 50, and she'd tell you life gets better as you figure out what really matters." They spun through the dance, and Grace found herself actually enjoying it. When the music shifted to a slower tune, Asher pulled her a bit closer, still respectable but intimate enough that Grace could feel the steady beat of his heart. "Thank you for coming with me," he said softly. "I know it wasn't easy." "Thank you for asking," Grace replied. "I'd forgotten what this felt like." "What?" "Feeling like I matter. Like I'm more than just work to be done and bills to be paid." Asher's eyes were serious. "You matter, Grace. You've always mattered. Some of us just need reminding sometimes." As the evening wore on, Grace found herself relaxing more. She talked with neighbors she'd been avoiding for years, laughed at stories, even had a second dance with Asher. When they finally climbed into the buckboard for the ride home, she felt lighter than she had in 3 years. "Did you have a good time?" Asher asked as they rode through the moonlit night. "I did," Grace admitted. "Better than I expected." "Good enough to do it again sometime." Grace looked at him, this man who'd appeared in her life like an answered prayer she hadn't known to make. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." The spring rains came late that year, and with them came trouble. The creek that ran through Grace's property swelled beyond its banks, threatening to flood the lower pastures where most of her cattle grazed. Grace and Asher worked desperately to move the herd to higher ground, spending 2 days in the rain, soaked to the skin and exhausted. On the second night, as they finally got the last of the cattle secured, Grace slipped in the mud. Asher caught her before she fell, his arms strong around her. For a moment they stood there in the rain, faces inches apart. "Grace," Asher said, his voice rough. She didn't let herself think, just leaned forward and kissed him. It was her first kiss in 3 years, and it felt like coming home and starting a new journey all at once. Asher responded gently, his lips warm against hers despite the cold rain. When they finally pulled apart, Grace was trembling. "I'm sorry," she started to say, but Asher shook his head. "Don't apologize for that," he said firmly. "I've been wanting to kiss you for weeks, but I was trying to be respectful, trying to court you proper." "Maybe I'm tired of proper," Grace said, surprising herself with her boldness. Asher's eyes darkened. "Grace Jennings, are you trying to compromise me?" Despite everything, she laughed. "Maybe I am." He kissed her again, longer this time, and Grace felt something inside her that had been frozen for 3 years finally begin to thaw. When they finally made their way back to the house, they were both shivering and covered in mud, but Grace couldn't remember being happier. "You should warm up," she said, suddenly shy again. "I'll heat water for coffee." "Grace," Asher said, catching her hand. "I meant what I said about courting you proper. I'm not here to take advantage. I'm here because I'm falling in love with you and I want to do this right." The words hit Grace like a physical force. "You're falling in love with me. Have been since the day I rode up and you stood on that porch looking like you could take on the world single-handed." Asher stepped closer. "I know you think you're too old for romance, too worn down by life. But Grace, you're the strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known, and every day I spend with you just makes me more certain that I want to spend the rest of my days courting you if you'll have me." Tears mixed with rain on Grace's face. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I buried one husband. I don't know if I can risk that kind of loss again." "I can't promise I'll never die," Asher said honestly. "None of us can promise that, but I can promise that every day I have, I'll make you feel cherished. I'll court you like you're 18 again, like every day is a chance to win your heart all over again." Grace looked at this man who'd come into her life and changed everything. "I'm falling in love with you too," she admitted. "It terrifies me, but it's true." Asher pulled her close, held her in the rain as thunder rumbled in the distance. "Then let's be terrified together." After that night, things changed between them. Asher continued to sleep in the bunkhouse, continued to maintain propriety, but there was a new understanding between them. He courted her with a dedication that would have put younger men to shame, bringing her flowers he found in the hills, leaving little notes tucked into her work gloves, playing his harmonica while she cooked dinner. But he also treated her as a partner. When decisions needed to be made about the ranch, he consulted her. When she had ideas, he listened and helped implement them. They expanded the herd together, repaired the barn together, planned for the future together. One evening in early summer, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the dusk, Asher said, "I need to go into town tomorrow. There's something I need to pick up." "What's that?" Grace asked. "It's a surprise," he said, that gentle smile playing at his lips. He returned the next afternoon with a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Walk with me," he asked. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and joined him. They walked to the top of the hill that overlooked the ranch, the place where Thomas was buried under a simple wooden cross. Grace visited less often now, but the spot still meant something to her. "I wanted to come here," Asher said, "because I think Thomas should hear this too." Grace looked at him in surprise. Asher knelt down on one knee and Grace's breath caught. "Grace Jennings, I know you think romance is for young girls and that you're too worn for this kind of thing. But I'm here to tell you that you're wrong. You're not too worn, you're not too old, and you deserve to be courted and loved and cherished for the remarkable woman you are." He pulled out the package and unwrapped it, revealing a simple gold band with a small ruby set in it. "This was my grandmother's ring. She gave it to me before she died and told me to give it to a woman who had strength and grace in equal measure. Grace, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life courting you, making you feel as special as you make me feel? Tears streamed down Grace's face. She looked at Thomas's grave, and for the first time, she didn't feel guilt. She felt like she had permission to move forward, to embrace this second chance. Yes, she said, her voice strong despite the tears. Yes, Asher Kane, I'll marry you. He slipped the ring on her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he stood and kissed her, long and deep, while the California sun painted the sky gold and the land they'd worked together stretched out below them. They were married in the same church where they'd had their first dance, on a warm July day in 1880. Grace wore a simple cream-colored dress that Martha Peterson had helped her pick out, and she carried wildflowers that Asher had gathered that morning. She was 34 years old and had never felt more beautiful. Asher stood at the altar in a new suit, his eyes never leaving her face as she walked down the aisle. There was no one to give her away. She was her own woman, choosing her own future. But the church was full of neighbors and friends who'd watched Grace survive and now celebrated her choosing to truly live again. I never thought I'd do this again, Grace whispered as they stood before the minister. Neither did I, Asher whispered back, but I'm glad we're doing it together. The minister, an elderly man named Reverend Thompson, smiled at them both. We're gathered here today to witness the union of Grace Jennings and Asher Kane, two people who have known loss and found each other, two people who prove that it's never too late for love. Grace barely heard the traditional words. She was too focused on Asher's face, on the love and commitment she saw there. When it came time for vows, Asher spoke first. Grace, when I rode up to your ranch 3 months ago, I was looking for work. I found so much more. I found a woman who reminded me that strength doesn't mean never needing help, and love doesn't mean never being scared. I promise to court you every day of our lives, to make you feel cherished and valued, to be your partner in all things. I promise to love you not despite the years you've lived, but because of them, because they made you who you are. Grace had to take a moment to compose herself before she could speak. Asher, you came into my life when I'd convinced myself that part of my story was over. You showed me that I wasn't too worn for romance, that I deserved to be courted and loved. You treated me like I was 18 again while respecting the woman I've become. I promise to love you with all the strength I have, to build a life with you, to be your partner and your love for all our days. They exchanged rings, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Asher kissed her with such tenderness that Grace forgot there was anyone else in the church. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Martha Peterson had organized the church ladies to provide food, and someone had brought a fiddle. Grace danced with her new husband, and this time there was no self-consciousness, no feeling that she was too old for such things. She was simply a woman in love, celebrating the beginning of a new chapter. As the evening wore on and the guests began to leave, Asher pulled Grace aside. Ready to go home, Mrs. Kane? Grace smiled at the new name. More than ready, Mr. Kane. They rode back to the ranch together in the buckboard, Grace tucked against Asher's side. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the summer air was warm and sweet with the scent of grass and wildflowers. I love you, Grace said, the words still feeling new and wonderful in her mouth. I love you too, Asher replied, and I'm going to tell you that every day for the rest of our lives. True to his word, Asher continued to court Grace even after they were married. He would leave little notes in her lunch pail when she went out to check the cattle. He'd pick wildflowers for her table. He'd play his harmonica while she read in the evenings. But more than that, he treated her as a true partner in running the ranch. Together, They expanded the operation. Grace had always had good instincts about cattle, and Asher had the experience to implement her ideas. By the fall of 1880, their herd had nearly doubled. They hired 2 additional hands to help with the work, and the ranch that had been barely surviving under Grace's solo management began to thrive. "You know what I think," Asher said one evening as they reviewed their accounts. "I think you always had the knowledge to make this place successful. You just needed someone to believe in you." "I needed a partner," Grace corrected. "Someone who saw me as capable, not just as a woman who needed taking care of." "You are capable," Asher said, pulling her into his arms. "You're the most capable person I know, but everyone needs a partner, man or woman. That's not weakness. That's wisdom." As autumn turned to winter, Grace discovered she was pregnant. At 35, she'd thought that particular possibility was behind her. The news filled her with equal parts joy and fear. "What if something goes wrong?" she said to Asher, her hand on her still flat stomach. "I'm not young, Asher. Women my age having babies, it's dangerous." Asher took her hands in his. "We'll get you the best care we can, we'll be careful, but Grace, this baby is a blessing, a sign that we're building something new together." "Are you scared?" she asked. "Terrified," he admitted, "but I'm also hopeful. And I'll be with you every step of the way." The pregnancy was harder than Grace remembered from her first child, a daughter who died of fever when she was only 2, years before Thomas passed. But Asher was true to his word, taking on extra work so Grace could rest, bringing her tea and crackers when morning sickness hit, rubbing her aching back in the evenings. "You're spoiling me," Grace said one night as Asher massaged her swollen feet. "Good," he replied. "You deserve to be spoiled. Besides, you're growing our child. That's hard work." In March of 1881, on a night when the rain drummed against the roof and the wind howled around the corners of the house, Grace went into labor. Asher rode through the storm to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Chen, who delivered half the babies in San Jose. The labor was long and difficult. As dawn broke, Grace was exhausted and scared. "I can't do this," she gasped between contractions. Asher was right there, holding her hand, his face pale but determined. "Yes, you can. Grace, you're the strongest person I know. You can do this." Mrs. Chen, calm and efficient, agreed. "You're doing fine, Mrs. Kane, just a bit more now." With a final tremendous effort, Grace pushed, and suddenly there was a new sound in the room, a baby's cry, strong and healthy. Mrs. Chen worked quickly, and then she was laying a small bundle in Grace's arms. "A son," she said with a smile. "A healthy baby boy." Grace looked down at the tiny red face, the small hands waving in the air, and felt her heart expand in a way she'd forgotten was possible. Asher leaned over, his eyes wet with tears. "He's perfect," Asher whispered. "Grace, he's perfect." "Thomas," Grace said softly. "I'd like to name him Thomas after my first husband, if that's all right with you." Asher kissed her forehead. "That's more than all right. Thomas Kane. It's a strong name." Little Thomas thrived from the start. He was a hungry, healthy baby who kept his parents busy and exhausted but happy. Grace marveled at how different this experience was from her first child. She was older, yes, but she also had Asher. He was a devoted father, walking the floor with Thomas when he cried at night, changing diapers without complaint, singing soft songs in his deep voice to lull the baby to sleep. "You're a natural at this," Grace said one evening, watching Asher rock their son. "So are you," Asher replied. "Look at us, a couple of worn-out people who thought their best days were behind them, and here we are with this perfect little person." Grace smiled. She didn't feel worn out anymore. She felt renewed, alive in a way she'd thought she'd never feel again. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Asher and Grace worked as a seamless team, making decisions together, supporting each other through challenges, celebrating successes together. The hands they'd hired became like family, and the ranch became known throughout the San Jose area for quality cattle and fair dealing. On their second anniversary, Asher surprised Grace with a trip to San Francisco. It was the first time Grace had been to the city in over a decade, and she was overwhelmed by the noise and bustle. But Asher had planned everything carefully. They stayed in a modest but clean hotel, ate at restaurants Grace had only dreamed of, and walked along the waterfront watching ships come and go. "This is too much," Grace protested, though she was smiling. "Nothing's too much for you," Asher said. "Grace, do you remember when you told me you were too worn for romance?" "I was wrong," Grace admitted. "You were. And I wanted to remind you of that. I wanted to show you that romance isn't just for young people. It's for anyone who chooses to embrace it, to make it part of their lives." That night, as they stood on the balcony of their hotel room watching the lights of the city, Grace reflected on how much her life had changed. 3 years ago, she'd been alone, convinced her life was over except for survival. Now she had a husband who loved her, a son who delighted her, and a future full of possibilities. "Thank you," she said to Asher. "For what?" "For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For courting me like I was 18 again. For showing me that it's never too late to start over." Asher pulled her close. "Thank you for taking a chance on a drifter who showed up looking for work. Thank you for loving me, for building this life with me, for giving me Thomas." They stood together in the San Francisco night, two people who'd found each other when they'd stopped looking, who'd built something beautiful out of loss and loneliness. When they returned to the ranch, little Thomas ran to meet them, now 2 years old and full of energy. He'd been staying with Martha Peterson, who'd become like a grandmother to him. "Did you two have a good time?" Martha asked, smiling at the obvious happiness on their faces. "Wonderful," Grace said. "Thank you so much for watching him." "My pleasure. This little one is a joy." Martha paused, then added, "You know, Grace, I've known you since you first came to San Jose as a young bride. I've never seen you as happy as you've been these past few years." Grace looked at Asher, who was swinging Thomas up onto his shoulders. "I've never been this happy," she said honestly. "I thought happiness was behind me, but I was wrong." Life settled into a comfortable rhythm over the next few years. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Thomas grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved following his father around the ranch. And Grace bloomed under Asher's continued courtship and partnership. "You know, people in town still talk about us," Grace mentioned one day as they worked together mending fence. "Oh, what do they say?" "They say Asher Kane courts his wife like they're still courting." "Martha told me some of the younger husbands complain because their wives see how you treat me and want the same." Asher grinned. "Good. Every woman deserves to be courted, not just before the wedding but after. Why would I stop showing you how much I love you just because we're already married?" Grace set down her tools and walked over to him. "I love you, Asher Kane. I love you more than I thought possible." "I love you too, Grace Kane, and I'll keep courting you until my dying day." In the summer of 1884, Grace discovered she was pregnant again. At 39, this pregnancy was even more concerning than the first had been, but she also felt more confident. She'd done this before. She had Asher. She would be fine. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because Grace knew what to expect. Asher fussed over her even more than he had with Thomas, which Grace found both endearing and occasionally annoying. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," she said when Asher tried to prevent her from lifting a basket of laundry. "I know," he said, "but humor me. Let me take care of you." Grace softened. "You always take care of me." and I always will. In February of 1885, on a clear, cold morning, Grace gave birth to a daughter. The labor was shorter this time, and when Mrs. Chen placed the baby in her arms, Grace wept with relief and joy. "A sister for Thomas," Asher said, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace, she's beautiful." "Sarah," Grace said, looking up at her husband, "for your first wife, she'd want to be remembered." Asher's eyes filled with tears. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Sarah's sacrifice, her life and death, brought you to me. She deserves to be honored." Little Sarah was a calm baby, easier than Thomas had been. Thomas, now 4 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything. Grace watched her family with a sense of contentment she'd never imagined possible. "Look at you," Martha said when she came to visit and bring a meal. "A mother of 2 at 39, looking happier and younger than you did at 34. Asher Kane is good for you." "He is," Grace agreed. "He reminds me every day that I'm loved, that I'm valued, that I matter." "That's what a good husband does," Martha said. "But you're good for him too. I've watched him these past 5 years. He was a lost man when he came to San Jose. Now he's found his purpose, his home." As Sarah grew from infant to toddler, the ranch expanded further. Asher and Grace bought an adjacent 20 acres from a retiring rancher, doubling their land. They built a larger house, with proper bedrooms for the children and a big kitchen where Grace could cook, and a parlor where the family could gather in the evenings. "Remember the first night I spent here?" Asher said as they stood in the new house, watching the children play. "I slept in that tiny bunkhouse, thinking I'd found a job for a few months. And instead you found a home for a lifetime," Grace finished. "The best decision I ever made was stopping at this ranch," Asher said. "Well, second best. The best was convincing you to marry me." Grace laughed. "As I recall, I didn't take much convincing once you got started." "That's because you knew a good thing when you saw it," Asher teased, pulling her close. They kissed, still passionate after 5 years of marriage, still in love, still committed to courting each other through all of life's changes. The years continued to pass, bringing both challenges and joys. There was the drought of 1887 that tested everything they'd built, but they weathered it together, making hard decisions about the herd and supporting each other through the stress. There was the year Thomas broke his arm falling out of a tree, and Grace discovered reserves of calm she didn't know she possessed. There was Sarah's 3rd birthday, when the whole community came to celebrate, and Grace looked around at the life she'd built, and could hardly recognize the lonely, worn woman she'd been. On their 10th anniversary in 1890, Asher organized a celebration at the ranch. Friends and neighbors gathered. There was music and dancing, and as Grace looked around at Thomas, now 9, and Sarah, now 5, at the prosperous ranch, at the community they'd built, she felt overwhelming gratitude. "Speech." Someone called, and Asher stood, pulling Grace up beside him. "10 years ago," Asher said, his arm around Grace's waist, "I married the most remarkable woman I've ever known. She thought she was too old for romance, too worn down by life for courtship. I made it my mission to prove her wrong, and I'm still working on that mission every day." The crowd laughed, and Grace felt her cheeks flush. "Grace taught me that it's never too late to start over, that strength comes in many forms, and that love only gets better as the years pass. She's my partner, my love, the mother of my children, and the reason I wake up grateful every morning. Here's to my beautiful wife and to at least 50 more years of courting her." Grace stood on her toes to kiss him, not caring that everyone was watching. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you too," Asher replied. "Today, tomorrow, and always." As the celebration continued into the evening, Grace found herself thinking about the woman she'd been 10 years ago. That Grace had been convinced her life was over, that romance and happiness were things of the past. She'd felt worn and used up, ready to simply survive until the end of her days. But Asher had seen something different. He'd seen a woman worth courting, worth loving, worth treating like she was special. And in treating her that way, he'd helped her become the woman she was now, confident, happy, secure in her worth and her abilities. "Thank you," she said to him later that night, after all the guests had gone and the children were asleep. "For what? For everything. For courting me when I thought I was too old. For loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. For building this life with me." Asher took her hand, brought it to his lips. "Grace, you gave me just as much. You gave me a home when I was drifting. You gave me a family when I was alone. You gave me a purpose beyond just getting through each day. We saved each other." It was true, Grace realized. Their love story wasn't about a man rescuing a helpless woman or a woman providing for a needy man. It was about two people who'd been broken by loss finding each other and choosing to build something new together. It was about partnership and respect and the kind of love that grows deeper with time. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing its own challenges and triumphs. Thomas grew into a responsible young man who loved the ranch and worked hard alongside his father. Sarah developed a gift for working with horses that amazed everyone who saw it. The ranch continued to prosper, becoming one of the most successful in the region. But through it all, the constant was Asher and Grace's love for each other. Asher never stopped courting his wife. Even as they grew older, even as Grace's hair turned fully gray and lines deepened around both their eyes, Asher continued to leave her little notes, to bring her flowers, to dance with her in the kitchen while dinner cooked. "You spoil me," Grace said one evening when she was 50, watching Asher set wildflowers on the table. "I love you," Asher replied simply. "Why would I stop showing you that?" In 1895, 15 years after they'd married, Asher and Grace sat on the porch of their home watching the sunset paint the California hills in shades of gold and crimson. Thomas was 24 now, married to a lovely young woman named Emily, and they lived in a house Asher and Grace had built on the far corner of the ranch. Sarah was 16, spirited and independent, determined to raise horses professionally. "We've built something good here," Grace said, her hand in Asher's. "We have," Asher agreed. "Better than I ever imagined that day I rode up looking for work. Do you ever regret it? Taking a chance on a widow who thought she was too old for romance?" Asher turned to look at her, his eyes still warm with love after all these years. "Grace Kane, loving you has been the greatest adventure of my life. Every day with you has been a gift. I don't have a single regret." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, content. She was 50 now, her body marked by years of hard work and childbearing, but she didn't feel worn or used up. She felt loved, cherished, valued. Asher had courted her like she was 18 again, and in doing so, he'd helped her discover that age was just a number. What mattered was the heart, the spirit, the willingness to embrace life and love in all its forms. "I love you, Asher Kane," she said. "Today, tomorrow, and always. And I love you, Grace Kane. You're as beautiful to me now as you were the day I first saw you standing on that porch, and you'll be beautiful to me when we're both old and gray and can barely get around." "We're already old and gray," Grace pointed out with a laugh. "Then we'll be older and grayer," Asher said, grinning. "And I'll still be courting you, still making sure you know how special you are." As the sun set and the stars began to appear, Grace reflected on her life. She'd loved and lost, survived and thrived, given up and found hope again. She'd been convinced she was too worn for romance, too old for love. But Asher had proven her wrong in the best possible way. Romance wasn't about age or appearance or circumstances. It was about choosing to see the worth in another person and showing them that worth every single day. It was about partnership and respect, and the kind of love that deepens with time rather than fading. It was about courting your beloved not just in the heady days of new love, but through all the years that followed, through challenges and changes, through the ordinary moments that made up a life. Grace had found that kind of love, and it had transformed her. She'd become more than she'd ever thought possible, not because Asher had changed her, but because he'd seen who she truly was and loved her for it. And in that love, she'd found the courage to become fully herself. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, comfortable in the silence that came from decades of companionship, Grace knew that this was what happiness looked like. Not the passionate excitement of youth, though they still had plenty of passion, but the deep contentment of two people who'd built a life together, who'd chosen each other every day, who'd proven that it was never too late for love. The ranch that had once been Grace's burden had become their shared legacy. The loneliness that had once defined her days had been replaced by the rich fullness of family and community. The woman who'd thought she was too worn for romance had discovered that she'd just been waiting for the right person to remind her of her worth. And Asher, the drifter who'd shown up looking for work, had found not just a job but a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that would sustain him for the rest of his life. Together, they'd proven that second chances were real, that love could bloom at any age, and that the best romances were the ones built on respect, partnership, and the daily choice to cherish one another. As the night deepened and they finally rose to go inside, Asher offered Grace his arm with the same courtly gesture he'd used since their courting days. Grace took it with a smile, and together they walked into the house they'd built, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that they'd face it together. The story of Grace and Asher Kane became something of a legend in San Jose and the surrounding area. People would point to them as proof that love could find you at any age, that it was never too late to start over, that romance wasn't just for the young. Young couples would come to them for advice, and Grace would always tell them the same thing. Choose each other every day, she'd say. Not just on your wedding day, but every day after. Court each other, respect each other, see the worth in each other. That's the secret to a love that lasts. And Asher would add with that gentle smile of his, and never let anyone tell you that you're too old for anything. Age is just a number. What matters is the heart. In 1900, as the new century dawned, Asher and Grace celebrated their 20th anniversary. Thomas and Emily had given them 3 grandchildren, and Sarah had married a rancher from a neighboring property and was expecting her first child. The ranch had grown into one of the largest and most successful in the region, a testament to what two people could build when they worked together. At their anniversary celebration, surrounded by family and friends, Asher stood to make a toast. He was 52 now, his dark hair liberally streaked with gray, but his eyes were as warm and his smile as genuine as they'd been 20 years earlier. 20 years ago, he said, I married a woman who thought she was too worn for romance. I've spent every day since then proving her wrong, and I plan to spend every day I have left doing the same. Grace, you've made my life richer than I ever dreamed possible. You've given me a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that grows stronger every year. Here's to 20 more years and 20 after that, and as many years as God grants us together. Grace stood beside him, her hand in his. At 54, she was still beautiful, her eyes bright with love and life, her smile radiant. Asher Kane, you took a lonely widow who'd given up on happiness and showed her that life still held endless possibilities. You courted me like I was 18 again, and you've never stopped. You've been my partner, my love, my best friend. I thank God every day for the moment you rode up to my door looking for work. I love you today and always." They kissed to applause and cheers. Two people who'd found each other when they'd needed it most, who'd built a love story that would inspire generations to come. As the celebration continued into the night, Grace found a quiet moment to stand at the edge of the gathering, looking out over the land she and Asher had built together. The ranch stretched out under the stars, prosperous and peaceful. The house was full of laughter and love. Her children were happy and healthy. Her grandchildren were growing strong. It was more than she'd ever dreamed possible that day 15 years ago when she'd stood in her doorway, convinced she was too worn for anything but survival. But Asher had shown her differently. He'd seen the woman she was, not the worn-down widow she thought she'd become. And in seeing her clearly, in courting her with dedication and respect, he'd helped her rediscover herself. Asher came to stand beside her, slipping his arm around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About how far we've come," Grace said. "About how lucky I am." "We're both lucky," Asher corrected. "We found each other and we had the courage to take a chance on love even when it seemed impossible." Grace turned to face him, this man who'd changed her life in every way that mattered. "Court me, Asher Kane," he smiled, understanding immediately. "Grace Kane, you are the most beautiful woman I've ever known. Your strength amazes me, your kindness humbles me, and your love sustains me. Would you do me the honor of dancing with me under the stars?" Grace took his hand. "I would be delighted." And there, under the California stars, with the sounds of their anniversary celebration drifting on the warm night air, Asher and Grace danced. They moved together with the ease of long practice. Two people who knew each other intimately, who'd weathered storms and celebrated triumphs, who'd built a life of love and partnership. They were older now, marked by the years they'd lived and the work they'd done. But in that moment, dancing under the stars, they could have been any age. They were simply two people in love, choosing each other once again as they had every day for 20 years and would continue to do for all the days to come. The music drifted on the night air, and Asher held Grace close, this woman who'd captured his heart and never let it go. He'd promised to court her like she was 18 again, and he'd kept that promise. Not because he saw her as young and inexperienced, but because he saw her as precious and deserving of being cherished. Every gray hair, every line, every mark of the years she'd lived just made her more beautiful to him, because they were evidence of the life she'd lived, the strength she'd shown, the woman she'd become. And Grace, held safe in her husband's arms, knew that she'd been wrong all those years ago. She hadn't been too worn for romance. She'd just been waiting for the right person to show her what real romance looked like. Not flowers and pretty words, though Asher had given her plenty of both, but respect and partnership and the daily choice to see and honor each other's worth. As they danced into the night, surrounded by the life they'd built and the love they'd nurtured, Grace and Asher Kane proved that the best love stories aren't always about young passion. Sometimes they're about second chances, about people who find each other when they need it most, about the courage to open your heart even when you think it's too late. And sometimes, the greatest romance of all is the one that sees you not as you were or as you wish you could be, but as you truly are, and loves you all the more for it. The years continued to flow like water, each one bringing its own joys and sorrows, its own challenges and triumphs. But through it all, Asher and Grace Kane remained constant, their love a foundation that held firm through every storm. When Asher turned 60 in 1908, the whole family gathered to celebrate. Thomas was now 37, running the ranch alongside his aging father. Sarah was 29, with 3 children of her own and a thriving horse breeding operation. The grandchildren numbered 7 in total, ranging from 18 to just 3 years old. Grace, now 62, organized the celebration with the help of her daughters-in-law and Sarah. As she worked in the kitchen, preparing Asher's favorite foods, she marveled at how her life had turned out. The lonely widow who'd thought her best days were behind her had lived to see a family that spanned 3 generations, all rooted in the love she and Asher had built together. "Grandmother, can I help?" asked her oldest granddaughter, Margaret, Thomas's daughter. "Of course, dear," Grace said, handing her a bowl to stir. "You know, when I was your age, I was already married to my first husband. Life was so different then. Were you happy?" Margaret asked with the directness of youth. Grace considered the question. "I was content. I loved Thomas, my first husband, and we had a good life together, even though it was short. But I didn't know what real partnership looked like until I met your grandfather. He taught me that marriage could be more than just 2 people sharing a home. It could be a true joining of hearts and minds." "Grandfather still brings you flowers every week," Margaret said. "None of my friends' grandfathers do that." Grace smiled. "Your grandfather is special. He's been courting me for 28 years, and he shows no signs of stopping." The celebration was joyful, with food and music and laughter filling the house. Asher, his hair now fully white but his eyes still bright, held court surrounded by his children and grandchildren. When Grace brought out the cake she'd made, he pulled her onto his lap despite her protests. "Asher Kane, we're too old for such things," she said, though she was smiling. "Never too old," he replied, kissing her soundly. "I'll never be too old to show my wife how much I love her." The grandchildren giggled, and Thomas shook his head with a fond smile. "You two are incorrigible." "We're in love," Asher corrected. "There's a difference." As the evening wore on and the younger grandchildren were put to bed, the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset. It had become a tradition, this evening gathering, a time to reflect and share and simply be together. "Dad," Thomas said, "I want to thank you for everything you've taught me about how to treat a wife, how to be a partner, how to build a life. Watching you and Mom all these years has shown me what marriage should look like." Asher reached for Grace's hand. "Your mother taught me just as much as I taught her. More, probably. She showed me that it's never too late to start over, that love can heal even the deepest wounds, that strength comes in many forms." "You both taught us," Sarah added. "You showed us that real love isn't about grand gestures, though you've certainly made plenty of those, Dad. It's about showing up every day, choosing each other every day, seeing each other clearly and loving what you see." Grace felt tears prick her eyes. "We just tried to build a good life together," she said. "We didn't always get it right, but we kept trying." "And you never stopped courting each other," Emily, Thomas's wife, said. "That's the part that amazes me. After all these years, you still treat each other like you're newlyweds." "Why would we stop?" Asher asked. "Grace deserves to be courted, to be shown she's special, to be loved well. That doesn't change just because we've been married for decades." As the sun set and the stars began to appear, the family sat together in comfortable silence. Grace leaned against Asher, feeling the steady beat of his heart, grateful for every moment they'd been given together. The years had not always been easy. There had been droughts and illnesses, disagreements and disappointments, all the challenges that come with building a life. But through it all, they'd had each other. They'd faced everything as partners, supporting each other, lifting each other up, choosing love even when it was hard. And now, surrounded by the family they'd built and the legacy they'd created, Grace knew that every moment had been worth it. The lonely widow who'd thought she was too worn for romance had discovered a love deeper and richer than anything she'd imagined in her youth. "I love you," she whispered to Asher. "I love you too," he replied. "Today, tomorrow, and always." In 1910, as Asher and Grace celebrated their 30th anniversary, they decided to take another trip to San Francisco. It had been 20 years since their last visit, and the city had changed dramatically. But so had they. They were older now, moving more slowly, but their love had only deepened with time. They stood on the same waterfront where they'd stood 30 years earlier, watching ships come and go. Grace was 64 now, Asher 62, and they held hands like the young couple they'd once been. 30 years, Grace said wonderingly. Where did the time go? Into building a life, Asher said. Into raising children and grandchildren, into growing a ranch, into loving each other. I wouldn't trade a single moment of it. Even the hard times, Grace asked. Especially the hard times, Asher said. Those are the moments that showed us what we were made of, what we could survive together. Grace, you've made every day of the past 30 years an adventure. You've challenged me, supported me, loved me, partnered with me. You've been everything I could have asked for in a wife and more. Grace turned to face him fully. Asher, when you rode up to my ranch all those years ago, I was dead inside. I was just going through the motions of living, convinced that happiness was behind me. You breathed life back into me. You showed me that I was still worthy of love, still capable of joy, still had so much to offer. You courted me like I was 18 again, and in doing so, you helped me remember who I was beneath all the grief and loneliness. You saved me too, Asher said softly. I was drifting, running from my grief, with no purpose beyond getting through each day. You gave me a home, a reason to put down roots, a future to build toward. You saw the man I could be and loved me into becoming him. They kissed there on the waterfront, two people who'd been through so much together, who'd built a love that had withstood the test of time. Around them, the city bustled with life, but in that moment they were alone in their own world, a world built on 30 years of love and partnership. When they returned to the ranch, they found it thriving as always. Thomas had taken on more responsibility in recent years as Asher slowed down, and he ran the operation with the same care and dedication his parents had shown. Sarah's horse breeding program had gained regional recognition, and she'd expanded into training as well. Grace settled back into her routines, grateful for the trip but happy to be home. This ranch, this land, this life they'd built together, this was where she belonged. Not because she was trapped here, but because she'd chosen it, built it, made it into something beautiful alongside the man she loved. As autumn turned to winter, Asher developed a persistent cough. At first, Grace wasn't too concerned. It was just a cough, nothing serious. But as weeks passed and it didn't improve, worry began to gnaw at her. "You need to see a doctor," she said one evening after a particularly bad coughing fit. "I'm fine," Asher insisted. "It's just a cough." But Grace could be stubborn when it came to the people she loved. She insisted, and finally, Asher agreed to see the doctor in San Jose. The news wasn't good. The doctor diagnosed pneumonia and prescribed rest and medicine. Grace threw herself into nursing Asher, determined to will him back to health through sheer force of love if necessary. "You're hovering," Asher said one afternoon, but his voice was fond. "I'm caring for you," Grace corrected. "The way you've cared for me all these years. Grace, come here." Asher patted the bed beside him and Grace sat down carefully. "I'm going to be fine." "You're not getting rid of me that easily." "You better be fine," Grace said fiercely. "I'm not done with you yet. We've got years left to live, grandchildren to spoil, a ranch to run." "Then I better get well," Asher said, pulling her down for a kiss. "Can't disappoint my wife." It took weeks, but slowly, Asher recovered. Grace barely left his side, bringing him food and medicine, reading to him, simply being there. And as he grew stronger, Asher marveled at the woman who'd been by his side for 30 years. "You know what I realized while I was sick?" he said one day as he sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the winter chill. "What's that?" Grace asked, sitting beside him. "I realized that I've been the luckiest man alive. I got 30 years with you, Grace. 30 years of love and partnership and joy. Even if I'd died, it would have been worth it, every moment we've had together." "Don't talk like that," Grace said sharply. "You're not dying. You're going to be around for many more years." "I plan to be," Asher assured her, "but I wanted you to know. I wanted you to understand how much these years have meant to me, how much you mean to me. You're not just my wife, Grace. You're my best friend, my partner, the love of my life. You're the reason I wake up grateful every morning." Grace felt tears on her cheeks. "You're all those things to me too. Asher, you saved me from a half-life of loneliness. You showed me what real love looks like. You've courted me for 30 years, made me feel special and cherished every single day. I can't imagine my life without you in it." They sat together in the winter sunshine, holding hands, two people who'd weathered storms and come out stronger. Asher's illness had been frightening, but it had also reminded them of how precious their time together was, how important it was to cherish every moment. As Asher regained his strength, he made a decision. "I'm slowing down," he told Thomas. "The ranch is yours now in everything but name. Your mother and I have done our part. It's time for the next generation to take over." Thomas looked concerned. "Are you sure, Dad? You love this ranch." "I do," Asher agreed. "But I love your mother more, and I want to spend whatever years I have left enjoying life with her, not working myself into the ground. We've earned a rest." So Asher and Grace stepped back from the day-to-day running of the ranch. They were still there for advice and support, but the hard work fell to younger shoulders. And with their newfound freedom, they rediscovered the joy of simply being together. They took long walks through the hills they'd worked for decades. They sat on the porch and watched sunsets. They played with their grandchildren without the distraction of ranch work always calling. They traveled to San Francisco again and to Los Angeles and even to the Grand Canyon, marveling at the wonders of the world. And through it all, Asher continued to court Grace. He still brought her flowers. He still left her little notes. He still danced with her in the kitchen and told her she was beautiful. Age hadn't dimmed his devotion. If anything, it had deepened it. On their 35th anniversary in 1915, the whole family gathered again. Grace was now 69, Asher 67, and they had 9 grandchildren ranging from 23 to 8 years old. There were even whispers of great-grandchildren on the way as the oldest grandchildren began to marry. 35 years, Grace said as they stood together before the assembled family. 35 years since I married the man who changed my life. Asher, you've courted me like I was 18 again, every single day. You've made me feel loved and cherished and special. You've been my partner in all things. I thank God for you every day." Asher took her hands in his. "Grace, 35 years ago you were a widow who thought she was too worn for romance. I made it my mission to prove you wrong, and I hope I've succeeded. You're not worn. You're refined, like good wine or well-aged leather. Every year with you has been better than the last. You're my love, my life, my everything." They kissed to applause and cheers, and then they danced. They moved more slowly now, their steps less sure than they'd once been, but the love between them was as strong as ever. And as their family watched, they saw a testament to what love could be when nurtured and cherished, when both partners chose each other every single day. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. In 1918, the world was rocked by the Great War and the flu pandemic that followed. The Kane family weathered both, though not without loss. Grace's oldest granddaughter, Margaret, lost her young husband to the war, leaving her a widow with two small children. Grace held her granddaughter as she wept, understanding her pain in a way few others could. "I know it hurts," she said softly. "I know it feels like your life is over, like you'll never be happy again. But I promise you it gets better. You'll always miss him, but the pain will ease. And who knows? Maybe someday you'll find love again like I did. Did you think you'd never love again when your first husband died?" Margaret asked. "I did," Grace admitted. "I thought I was too old, too worn down by life. But your grandfather showed me I was wrong. He showed me that love can find you at any age, in any circumstance, if you're willing to open your heart to it." Margaret dried her tears. "I hope I can be as strong as you, grandmother." "You're already strong," Grace said. "You just don't know it yet." As the 1920s dawned, bringing a new decade of change and progress, Asher and Grace found themselves in their 70s. They moved more slowly now. Their hair was white, their faces lined, their bodies bearing the marks of 7 decades of life. But their love remained constant. Asher still courted Grace. He couldn't walk as far to find wildflowers, so he grew them in a garden specifically for her. He couldn't dance as long, but he still asked her for at least one dance every evening. He couldn't do hard labor anymore, but he could still write her love notes and tell her she was beautiful and hold her hand while they watched the sunset. And Grace still loved him with the fierce devotion that had characterized their marriage. She made his favorite foods even when her arthritis made cooking difficult. She sat with him on the porch even when her own aches and pains called for rest. She told him every day that she loved him, that he'd made her life worth living, that she was grateful for every moment they'd shared. On their 40th anniversary in 1920, the celebration was quieter than previous ones had been. Asher's health was declining, and he tired easily. But the love between them shone as brightly as ever. 40 years, Asher said, holding Grace's hand. 40 years of being loved by the most remarkable woman I've ever known. 40 years of being courted like I was 18 again, Grace replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Asher, you've given me the greatest gift anyone could give. You've made me feel valued and cherished every single day. You saw worth in me when I'd forgotten I had any. You loved me into being the woman I was meant to be. And you gave me a home when I was lost," Asher said. "You gave me purpose and family and love beyond measure. Every day with you has been a blessing, Grace. Every single day." They sat together in the afternoon sunshine. Two people who'd built a lifetime of love, who'd proven that romance wasn't just for the young, that it was never too late to start over, that real love only deepened with time. As 1922 approached, Asher's health continued to decline. He was 74 now, and the years of hard work had taken their toll. But even as his body weakened, his spirit remained strong, and his love for Grace never wavered. "I'm not afraid of dying," he told Grace one winter evening as they sat by the fire. "I've lived a full life. I've loved well and been loved well in return. I've seen my children grow and thrive. I've held my grandchildren and even my great-grandchildren. But I hate the thought of leaving you." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere." "Grace, we both know I'm not going to live forever. None of us do." Asher took her hand gently. "But I need you to promise me something." "Anything," Grace said. "Promise me you won't close yourself off again. Promise me you'll keep living, keep finding joy, keep being the remarkable woman I fell in love with. Don't let my death steal your life the way Thomas's death almost did." "Asher, I was 34 when Thomas died. I'm 76 now. It's different." Age is just a number, remember? You taught me that. Promise me, Grace. Through her tears, Grace nodded. I promise, but you're not leaving me yet. We've got more years together. They did have more years, though not as many as Grace hoped. In the spring of 1923, Asher passed away peacefully in his sleep, Grace's hand in his. He was 75 years old and had lived a full, rich life. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of San Jose and the surrounding area. Asher Kane had been respected and loved by all who knew him, but no one mourned him more deeply than Grace. She'd lost her partner of 43 years, the man who'd courted her like she was 18 again, the love of her life. But even in her grief, Grace remembered her promise. She wouldn't close herself off. She would keep living, keep finding joy, keep honoring the love they'd built together by being the woman Asher had helped her become. The years after Asher's death were hard for Grace. She missed him with an ache that never fully went away. But she also discovered that the foundation he'd helped her build was strong enough to support her even in his absence. She had a family that loved her, a community that respected her, and a lifetime of memories to sustain her. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, sharing stories of Asher and the life they'd built together. She continued to tend the flower garden he'd planted for her. She sat on the porch every evening and watched the sunset, remembering all the sunsets they'd watched together. And she found joy, not the same joy she'd known with Asher, but a quieter contentment. She took pride in seeing the ranch continue to thrive under Thomas's care. She delighted in her great-grandchildren's antics. She found satisfaction in the life she'd lived and the legacy she'd helped create. Margaret, her granddaughter who'd lost her husband in the war, had eventually remarried, finding love again with a kind widower. Watching her granddaughter build a second chance at happiness reminded Grace of her own journey, and she was grateful that she'd been able to pass on the lesson Asher had taught her. It's never too late for love. Grace lived to be 82 years old, surrounded by family until the end. In her final days, in the summer of 1928, she spoke often of Asher, of the love they'd shared, of the life they'd built. He courted me like I was 18 again, she told her great-granddaughter Emma, who was 18 herself and newly engaged. Every single day for 43 years he made me feel special and loved. That's the secret to a good marriage, Emma. Never stop courting each other. Never stop choosing each other. Never stop seeing the worth in each other. Did you ever regret it? Emma asked. Remarrying after your first husband died, Grace smiled. Not for a single moment. Asher showed me that life could still hold joy and love even after loss. He proved that I wasn't too worn for romance, that age was just a number, that it's never too late to start over. He gave me 43 years of happiness I never thought I'd have. How could I regret that? On a warm July evening, Grace Jennings Kane passed away peacefully in her sleep. She was buried next to Asher on the hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, the ranch that now sprawled over hundreds of acres and supported 3 generations of their family. At her funeral, Thomas stood to speak about his mother. "My mother taught me many things," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the most important lesson came from watching her and my father together. They showed me that real love isn't about age or circumstances or perfect conditions. It's about choosing each other every day, about seeing and honoring each other's worth, about building something beautiful together one day at a time. My father used to say that my mother thought she was too worn for romance when they met. He made it his life's work to prove her wrong. And in doing so, he showed all of us what love should look like. Not just the passion of youth, but the deep partnership that comes from years of choosing each other, supporting each other, courting each other. They built a legacy here that goes far beyond this ranch. They built a family founded on love and respect. They showed us that it's never too late for a second chance. That age is just a number, that the best romances are the ones that deepen with time. And now they're together again, watching over the legacy they created, the love they built, the family they raised. As the sun set over the California hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the family gathered on the hill where Grace and Asher rested side by side. Their graves were simple but well tended, surrounded by the wildflowers Asher had loved to bring his wife. And if you listened carefully, you might almost hear music on the wind, the sound of a harmonica playing old songs, the rustle of a woman's skirts as she danced, the laughter of two people who'd found love when they'd stopped looking for it and who'd built a lifetime of happiness together. The story of Grace and Asher Kane became a legend in San Jose and beyond. Generations of their descendants would tell the tale of the widow who thought she was too worn for romance, and the cowboy who courted her like she was 18 again. They'd speak of the love that transformed both of their lives, the partnership that built a legacy, the romance that proved it's never too late for a second chance. And that legacy lived on in the ranch that still bore their name, in the family that carried their values forward, in the lesson they'd taught through their lives. That love isn't bound by age or circumstance, that everyone deserves to be courted and cherished, and that the best love stories are the ones built on respect, partnership, and the daily choice to see and honor each other's worth. Grace and Asher Kane had proven that worn wasn't the same as worthless, that older didn't mean incapable of romance, that the heart's capacity for love only grew with time if you let it. They'd built a love that lasted a lifetime and a legacy that would endure for generations, all because a cowboy had seen worth in a widow and had dedicated himself to making sure she saw it too. Their story was one of second chances and new beginnings, of love found when least expected, of two people who'd been broken by loss finding wholeness in each other. It was a story that reminded everyone who heard it that it's never too late to start over, never too late to fall in love, never too late to build something beautiful. And on quiet evenings, when the sun set over the California hills and the wind whispered through the grass, if you stood on that hill where they rested together, you might feel it. The enduring presence of a love that had conquered loneliness and loss, that had built a family and a legacy, that had proven beyond doubt that romance wasn't just for the young, but for anyone brave enough to open their heart to it. Grace and Asher Kane's love story ended, as all love stories must, with death. But the love itself never ended. It lived on in their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It lived on in the ranch they'd built and the community they'd served. It lived on in the lesson they'd taught, that it's never too late for love, that everyone deserves to be courted and cherished, and that the best romances are the ones that grow deeper with each passing year. The widow who'd believed she was too worn for romance had discovered the greatest love of her life. The cowboy who'd courted her like she was 18 again had found his home and his purpose. Together, they'd built something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love that would inspire generations to come. And that was the true end of their story, not an ending at all, but a beginning that would ripple forward through time, touching lives and changing hearts, proving over and over again that love, real love, transcends age and circumstance and even death itself. It lives on, eternal and unchanging in the hearts of those who choose to embrace it, nurture it, and let it transform their lives.